So today I'm going to be talking about Eclipse attacks, and I'll explain what Eclipse attacks are as we go on. Essentially, the idea is that a lot of times when we talk about blockchains, we have this assumption that users have a perfect view of the blockchain, that they have perfect information. And so we're going to look at what happens when this assumption is violated. And then we're also going to look at how Bitcoin ensures users have a good view of the blockchain. So Bitcoin relies on its peer-to-peer network to do this. And this is a little bit of a generalization, but the way Bitcoin's peer-to-peer network works is that you have around 8, and these are the defaults, outgoing TCP connections to other nodes in the network. And you can accept up to 117 incoming connections. So you're always going to be making these outgoing connections. And you're always going to ensure that you have 8. If you have 7, you'll keep trying to make a connection. And people will connect to you, but you probably won't have 117. You make no effort if you don't have 117. And in many cases, we see that users have 20 or so. And these connections are used to form a peer-to-peer gossip network that propagate Bitcoin transactions and blocks. The arrows represent the directionality of the connection. That is that the purple node is connecting out to another node, but information can propagate in both directions. So an Eclipse attack is a term from peer-to-peer networking, and it's when an adversary gains control over a node's access to information in a peer-to-peer network. So, for instance, if this, if the purple node was only talking to attacker nodes, then the attacker would be able to selectively deny access to information or provide the purple node with information that the purple node wouldn't be able to tell anyone about. We're going to do it by manipulating the peer-to-peer network such that we can eclipse a target node. So this is a off-path attacker. So they're not your ISP. They're some kid on the internet with a botnet. We're going to draw it as if they're sitting between you and the rest of the network. But really, what this picture is showing is that they're sitting between you on the peer-to-peer network and the rest of the peer-to-peer network. But you could conceivably talk to these through the internet. You have just, the peer-to-peer network is set up such that you have chosen to only talk to attacker nodes. So the first thing I'm going to look at is we're going to just assume that attacker has managed to get this position where they've essentially surrounded all of your connections by manipulating the peer-to-peer network, and look at what an attacker can do. So one attack an attacker can perform is if it eclipses a miner, and we're only looking at the peer-to-peer network. I realize that there's the fiber network where miners talk to each other as well, and there may be VPN connections between miners. But we want to examine the security of the peer-to-peer network in isolation to see how much security it provides. But this could also be, say, a network partition that occurs because of the Great Firewall of China or something like that, which would then have implications for fiber and VPN connections. So you have a miner with 30% of the mining power that's partitioned here, and you have the rest of the network with 30% of the mining power that's partitioned from the miner, and you have the attacker, which is 40% of the mining power, sitting here. So normally, if you have 40% of the mining power, you can't do a 51% attack. But because these two miners can't communicate with each other, they won't build on top of each other's blockchain. And so the attacker will actually be able to construct a longer blockchain with 40% of the mining power. So essentially, the attacker is outcompeting each partitioned miner. And we did 40% as an example, but if you imagine slicing the mining power up into 5% segments, then a 6% attacker could also perform this attack. Does that make sense to everyone? So another attack that an attacker could perform is a n confirmation. So choose a number n, say 6 confirmation, double spend. In this attack, the attacker has no mining power, but it eclipses a miner with 30% of the mining power and a merchant and puts them in their own partition. So they can talk to each other, but they can't talk to the rest of the network, and the rest of the network can't talk to them. And so what the attacker does is they say, like, I want to buy a car, and it shows the merchant a transaction where it spends a coin to the merchant and shows a number of confirmations on top of that. These are confirmations that are occurring by the Eclipse miner here. And the merchant's like fine with that. What the merchant doesn't realize is the rest of the network, which it can't see, there's a double spending transaction. The rest of the network has mined many more blocks. So what happens is that when the attacker just stops partitioning this, the longer blockchain will be preferred, the most difficulty blockchain, and the merchant will have sold the car and will not get any of the funds. So we're sort of looking at Bitcoin here. We're using it as an example. Other blockchains have slightly different, do this in a slightly different way. Botnets also have a similar peer selection system. But for our example, we're going to look at how Bitcoin's peer selection works. And the way in which Bitcoin's peer selection works is that it stores peers in a table called the new table and a table called the tried table. And the new table is IPs that the node has heard about. Someone told it this IP is a Bitcoin node. It has no evidence for this view. It just happens to believe that, and so they go in the new table. The tried table is IPs that the node has peered with at some point. So either the node connected to them or they connected to the node successfully. So it knows that these, at least at one point in time, were a Bitcoin node that it was talking to. And it puts these nodes in buckets, and I'll talk about that in the next slide of how it buckets them. So to find an IP, to make an outgoing connection, so remember you always want to have 8 outgoing connections. You choose from the new to tried table. You select so you flip a coin, am I going new or tried? Then you select a random bucket and IP from that bucket. So you go here and you select it. And then you attempt an outgoing connection to that IP with the special rule that if you already have an outgoing connection to the /16 that IP is from, you actually just retry. So you ensure that each of your outgoing connections are to different /16s. For those of you unfamiliar with the term /16, it's a way of dividing up IP addresses where the first 2 octets of the IP address are fixed and then the rest are free. So if you already have, if you have 2 IP addresses and they match on the first half of their IP address, you don't make another connection. And this is actually a really important property because it means that you can't just large IP allocation and then make all your connection and then perform an attack where you say fill a node with it. It requires a diverse IP addresses from different companies in different parts of the IP prefix. So how do IPs get into the tried table? We're actually not going to look at the new table that much in detail because it turns out the new table is just trivial to fill up with like just other trash. Since it doesn't look at them, just fill it up with trash. You'll never have to worry about a node that you're attacking pulling anything from the new table because it'll all be IP addresses that are like totally unroutable. So how does an IP address get into tried? So let's say someone connects to you. You learn their IP address, you want to put them in tried. So the first thing you do is you take the IP address and you break it in half. And the first half you call the group. This would also be the /16. And you hash it such that it matches one of four buckets. One of four buckets, and then you use the last part to determine which bucket the IP address goes into. So the first thing restricts it to four buckets, the /16 to the four buckets, and then the second half of the IP address selects which one of the four buckets it ends up going into. And this actually makes the attack much harder, and a really smart design decision on the point of the Bitcoin devs. If you have, say, a particular /16 and you want to fill it in, you're only going to be limited to these four buckets, and there's 256 buckets in here. So you'll just start replacing yourself. I should point out that these buckets can only contain 64 IP addresses. So you'd get 4 times 64 IP addresses, even if you had 1 million IP addresses, if they were all in the same /16. And for convenience, I'm just talking about IPv4. There's a bunch of different rules for IPv6, but they're generally the same. It's just that there's more IPv6 addresses, so they have different ways of breaking it up.
So right at the beginning of that slide, you just kind of hand waved and said we can fill the new table in trash. You just want to briefly expand on how an attacker might fill a new table with trash?
Sure. I think I might even have a slide on that. So because the new table is not IP addresses that connect to you, what an attacker would do is would connect to a node and be like, here's 2,000 new IP addresses that are totally real Bitcoin nodes. Here's their IP addresses. And then it would, again, be like, hey, here's 2,000 new IP addresses. And it would just fill up the whole table with nonsense.
Okay, so there's an RPC where you can give a node a bunch of IP addresses and it just takes them a minute.
When a node connects to you, it's expected to give you about 2,000 IP addresses.
Okay.
So it just sends them to you. And they are bucketed, I believe, by the source of the IP address that gave them to you. But once you have, say, 30 IP addresses or something, you can just totally fill it up. And they can just be... When we perform these attacks, we just use unroutable IP addresses. So what's our plan of attack for this? Well, we're going to manipulate a node, so all of its outgoing connections are to attacker IP addresses. We're going to fill the node's peer table attacker IPs by connecting to it a bunch of times from a bunch of different IP addresses. We're going to either cause the node to restart or wait for the node to restart so it loses its outgoing connections and remakes them from now a tried table that's totally filled with attacker IP addresses. And then the node will make, because it's pulling from a tried table that's almost entirely controlled by attacker IPs, it'll make new connections to only attacker IP addresses. We're going to assume an attacker can monopolize all incoming connections. But it's a little bit more complex today. But I think an attacker could, with a little bit of work, monopolize all incoming connections. So our attack requires the victim node to restart. So how can this happen? Well, there's a number of software and security updates that servers install. So you could just wait till Patch Tuesday or whatever, and then know that your node will reboot if it's a Microsoft node. And this kind of presents a lose-lose for the victim. Either they restart and get security updates and patch their software, or they remain vulnerable and then you just own them because they didn't patch their software. Also, there's Bitcoin nodes are constantly having updates and new releases that you want to install, and there'll be security issues that require that everyone upgrade their Bitcoin nodes. Additionally, you could cause the node to restart. There's been a number of packets of death. I think there's 10 denial of service CVEs in Bitcoin, and they stopped doing CVEs, it looks like. There's no more CVEs after 2015 or 2014 or something. So I don't think they're tracking them in CVEs. There's probably a bunch more. They just aren't being tracked in the CVE system. And then there's just also power and network failures. Someone did a study, this is actually fairly old at this point, where they looked at node churn, and they determined within 10 hours about 25% of nodes will go offline. That's probably very different now because the ecosystem has changed significantly. But just as a general rule, the security of the peer-to-peer network should not rely on 100% node uptime. That should not be the security mechanism that everyone stays secure. Default Bitcoin is this red line, and this is the attacker success probability. So this is 50% attacker success, and this is how many IPv4 addresses the attacker controls. So let's say the attacker has a botnet. With default Bitcoin, before these other changes, which have now been merged in, it's around like 400 IP addresses to ensure 50% success rate in totally filling tried. And if you want higher attacker success rate, you can just increase the number of IP addresses. We have, all right, so 595 IP addresses for 50% attacker success. We have a countermeasure called feeler connections, which is currently deployed, in which a node will take things from new and will test them with a connection. And if they're online, it will add them to tribe. So this makes it harder for an attacker. So if we look at, because there'll just be more things in tried, one of the things that we found was that tried didn't have a lot of IP addresses. So if you look at feeler connections, it actually takes around 5,000 attacker IP addresses to get a 50% chance of eclipsing a node. And then we have an additional change called test before evict, which is which requires even more IP addresses. Essentially, if you have to assume that you start in a good state, because if you start in a bad state, you've already lost. So you sort of, to have any hope at all, should assume that you've started in a good state, and therefore you don't want to evict any node that is still online because it's a good node. Because if it wasn't, you've probably already been eclipsed. Because once you're eclipsed, you can just stay eclipsed. You won't learn about new information.
So you don't, under the new rules, you don't evict nodes that are still online.
Right, you test them. And this was actually, so the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network is very similar to how botnets function. And so botnets have been heavily attacked. Microsoft had a whole team that was professionally attacking botnets, performing things like Eclipse attacks, partition attacks. So Microsoft, I believe it was Microsoft, took down like Waldeck. And so the Waldeck team came up with Storm and put a lot of countermeasures to these sorts of attacks. And so test before evict was we borrowed from Storm because it was much more effective and resisted Microsoft's attacks better. I believe it was Waldeck that was like a DHT for IP addresses, so it worked similar to how Ethereum did IP addresses, and it didn't have test before evict, and I think it didn't even have some of this bucketing stuff. So Microsoft just came through and flooded all the peer tables and evicted everything, and then Waldeck like fell over because they couldn't communicate anymore. So they went back to a simpler model and stopped playing around with DHTs. Or that's my understanding. I read the Storm papers in like 2015. So you should read the papers for yourself, though. They're really, really interesting. But we borrowed this idea from Storm. And this is actually, this original research was done in 2015, but we just got this deployed in Bitcoin Core in March. So
Storm, a research paper released by anonymous botnet operators?
No, so there's a bunch of papers that are like studies in how various botnets work. And so there was studies in how Waldeck worked, and then there was criminal proceedings of Waldeck, and Microsoft did a big takedown, and there was a bunch of news articles and studies of that. And then there were studies of Storm that came afterwards.
Okay.
So just comparing, these are a little bit out of date. You know, these aren't the cool new botnets today. But looking at like how many IP addresses are required, with test before evict, And feeler connections, it never actually quite gets to 100, even as you go out to say 40,000 IP addresses. But like when you compare it with something like Waldic, which has 160,000 IP addresses and 25,000 different IPv6 groups, it's still within the range of like a large botnet. Some of these numbers, these are numbers that we pulled from the research. Some of these numbers are a little controversial because it's really hard to tell the difference between a bot that then gets its IP address changed because it's like some Comcast person. So people debate exactly how big these numbers are, but I think they're within a ballpark. So these are IPv4, I believe. I think these things remain largely the same on IPv6. There's a lot of like open questions. Also, Tor is very interesting for this. If you're running a Bitcoin node, it's a hidden service. You can basically produce as many Tor addresses as you want. So you can't use the scarcity of addresses to prevent Sybil attacks the way that you can with IPv4. One question I hear a lot is, wouldn't this be detectable? And I agree it would be detectable, but detectable is not detected. We do think people should do anomaly detection, especially if they're running nodes. I would point out that that even if you were doing these 51% attacks, or with like less than 51% of the mining power, there's a lot of variance in when blocks are discovered. So it's not immediately obvious that you've been eclipsed from the other miners. Additionally, Chainalysis accidentally eclipsed a bunch of Bitcoin nodes, and no one really noticed. It was the Chainalysis people were trying to be safe, in that they put all of the IP addresses they were stuffing the people's tried table in, I think, in like a /23. So they'd assume they'd only get one outgoing connection. But what happened was that, like a lot of wallets, especially SPV wallets, did not obey that rule. They just would, rather than make 8 outgoing connections, they'd make only 3, and they'd make them to any IP address. So they ended up eclipsing a bunch of SPV wallets. And then also Chainalysis, the only reason anyone noticed that this happened, other than me, was that they also didn't forward blocks and transactions. So there was a bunch of wallets that just, they'd send transactions, and the transactions would never reach the network. We detected it because when we were doing the Eclipse attacks, we saw someone like aggressively connecting to us over and over and over again, like, I don't know, a couple times a second or something. Everything we've been talking about is an off-path attack so far. So the attacker can send messages to the victim, and the victim can send messages to the attacker. But the attacker can actually prevent the victim from talking to anyone. It can manipulate the peer-to-peer network, but if the victim wants to talk to IP address X, the victim can send a packet to IP address X. And so we're assuming an off-path attacker. An on-path attacker allows the attacker can send messages to the victim and receive all the messages that the victim sends to anyone, but it can't actually interfere with those messages. And this is what a lot of, like, for the most part, the Great Firewall and NSA's quantum program is limited to this. But with TCP, you can just inject reset traffic. You can just inject reset packets or other packets that break the packets when they arrive at this end. So it's similar to an on-path. It's similar to an in-path attack in that, in practice, you can actually interfere with connections and break them, but you can actually just say this packet never arrives. And then in path, the attacker can send messages to the victim and receive all the messages the victim sends. So the attacker can just like take a packet and be like, oh, this isn't getting anywhere, and not forward it on. One interesting thing about these Eclipse attacks is that an attacker starts here, but a lot of their capabilities, once they've successfully eclipsed a node, are like they're an in-path attacker. And Additionally, if an attacker was on path, it would be able to redirect a lot of connections of the peer-to-peer network and then essentially become an in-path attack for the same cost of being on path. So like if you were running the Great Firewall of China, you don't want to in anything because that's really expensive and it introduces a lot of delays and problems. But if you did want to, like, say, attack Bitcoin, you could just do a brief on-path attack that would break a lot of connections that would then force all those nodes to just connect to your node. And it would be as if you had an in-path attack without having to pay the cost of it. And you can go on GitHub. And then these are actually, so I mentioned that incoming connections, a little bit more complex now. So they've added a bunch of rules that if all 17 incoming connection slots are full and someone tries to connect to you, do you evict a current incoming connection slot for a new one? And here's the rules. But I don't think anyone has studied exactly how, exactly how this could be attacked and how easy it would be to attack and mathematically quantified its impact. And it may open up new attacks because someone's incoming connection is someone else's outgoing connection.